Alright, folks, and now I'm already up to page 10 of this Easy Anxiety magazine. So now I'm going to read it here. And over here it says, is essential for survival, says Ronald Siegel. Ronald Siegel, an assistant clinical professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School. Without it, our ancestors probably would have died off pretty quickly. Siegel says, Siegel says that millions of years of evolution have trained the human brain to operate in better safe than sorry mode and look for sources of danger around every corner. Imagine, he says, a prehistoric human wandering the African plains and spotting a tan-colored shape on the ground in the distance. In this scenario, he says the brain can make one of two types of errors. Either it can assume the shape is a lion when it's really just a rock, or it can assume the shape is a rock when it's really a lion. You can make the first error thousands of times and live, but if you make the second error once, that's the end of your DNA line. Siegel Siegel points out. As a consequence, natural selection has programmed the modern human brain not only to constantly scan its environment for potential threats, but also to anticipate the worst when it identifies a point of concern. This fear response is one of our most ancient motivational systems, and is one we share with all other animals, including insects, Siegel says. Almost everybody is a little anxious most of the time. It's simply a reality of being a human being. Siegel, 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 Siegel makes this point to emphasize the fact that some anxiety is unavoidable, and that in many cases it can be beneficial. If you're feeling anxious because you're driving through a snowstorm, the concern or fear you're experiencing can motivate you to take steps to remove yourself from that or other perilous, peril, perilous, like P-E-R. Here, let me get a pronouncer. All right, here we go. What is perilous? Oh wow, it just X'd me out of it, man. Wow, wait, it just totally X'd me out. All right, man. All right, so what is okay? Oh, perilous. Yeah, that's how you pronounce it.
Perilous.
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 Perilous. Okay, here it is. So, that or other perilous situations, that's a good thing. Anxiety is simply the activation of our fear response systems. He says, and there are plenty of circumstances when fear is helpful to us. But for some people, anxiety can be so constant, so severe, or so decoupled from exterior threats that it becomes physically and mentally debilitating for the individual. Anxiety is associated with depression and other mental health challenges. It can also cause or contribute to any number of physical and psychological symptoms. Siegel estimates that roughly 80% of doctors' office visits are due, at least in part, to physical symptoms that could be manifestations of anxiety. Gastrointestinal distress. All right, whatever. That's a new word. Chronic back pain and musculoskeletal pain. Musculoskeletal pain. Eczema. Certainly types of insomnia. Sexual dysfunction. These are what happen when the human body is in this aroused state of anxiousness continuously, he says. What really kicks anxiety into the level of a disorder, he adds, is when it starts to interfere with a person's ability to live life normally. Those are the newest words that I never heard of before in my life. Symptoms and diagnosis. Anxiety disorders are manifold, and each comes with its own symptoms and diagnostic criteria. These criteria are laid out in the latest edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, the handbook that doctors rely on to identify and diagnose mental health conditions. While the identification of some anxiety disorders seems straightforward for others, there ends up being a lot of room for interpretation. Generalized anxiety disorder, which is GAD, for example, is characterized by a steady state of fear or worry surrounding work, family, health, or in some cases, undefined sources, according to the DSM, the top line diagnostic criterion. For generalized anxiety disorder is excessive anxiety and worry occurring more days than not for at least 6 months about a number of events or activities, such as work or school performance. The anxiety that people with GAD experience is difficult to control and is associated with symptoms such as restlessness, problems, concentrating, fatigue, irrit- irrit- irritability, and muscle tension per the DSM. Those criteria may seem clear, but generalized anxiety disorder can be tricky to diagnose for several reasons. For one thing, many of those symptoms, restlessness, irritability, fatigue, are subjective and also non-specific, which is the term doctors use for symptoms that are associated with a broad range of health conditions at the same time. Those with GAD may also experience elements of depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, or other anxiety adjacent.
Adjacent. Adjacent.
Adjacent, yeah. Adjacent mental health concerns that muddle their symptoms and make diagnosis tricky. Some other anxiety disorders are a little simpler for doctors to nail down. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, people with panic disorders experience recurrent and unexpected panic attacks, which are periods of intense fear that come on suddenly and are accompanied by symptoms such as sweating, trembling, a racing heart, or feelings of impending doom. Panic attacks can cause people to feel as though they're going insane or are somehow detached from themselves, according to the DSM. Phobias, meanwhile, are feelings of intense fear or worry tied to a specific animal, activity, scenario, or other defined source. While many people have clearly identifiable phobias, they they may dislike flying in airplanes or speaking in public. To give two common examples, these fears do not rise to the level of a disorder until they start interfering with a person's life. If I get anxious before public speaking or flying in airplanes, but I do both anyway, I don't have a disorder. Siegel says, but when someone's anxiety is strong enough that they avoid the source of their fear or worry, and especially if that avoidance has a negative effect on the person's life, that's a major indicator of an anxiety disorder, he says. Other anxiety experts reiterate this point. For me, the biggest thing that determines whether anxiety is at the level of a disorder is the level of dysfunction or interference it causes in someone's life, says Holly Valerio, MD, a clinical assistant professor of of psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania and Perelman School of Medicine. If you can't sleep at night because of worry or worry is impacting your work or school, that's more in the realm of disorder. She says disordered anxiety could take the form of distracting or distressing thoughts, but it could also take the form of disruptive physical symptoms, headaches, muscle tension, or gastrointestinal problems that a person might not realize are brought on by anxiety. In some cases, the environment and context matter. Let's say I'm afraid of horseback riding because of a bad experience I had as a kid. Dr. Valerio says that fear doesn't impact my life because I live in Philadelphia, not on a cattle ranch. All these caveats, C-A-V-E, caveats, I don't know, let's see. Caveat. That's what it is. All these caveats and if then stipulations can make the diagnosis of an anxiety disorder a thorny proposition and one that requires a professional's assessment. You ask some people if their anxiety is interfering with their life, and they say no, says Michelle Newman, director of the Laboratory for Anxiety and Depression Research at Penn State University. But then, when you ask if they have problems falling asleep or concentrating or if they worry all the time, they say yes. the internal impact. While many people use the word stress and anxiety interchangeably, mental health experts draw a subtle distinction between the two. Stress is the cause or source of anxiety, while anxiety is the brain and body's response to that stressor. Stress is the interpretation or perception of something as dangerous or problematic, while anxiety is the emotional response this perception elicits. Newman explains to illustrate the difference. She describes two people stuck in a traffic jam. If both are running late for work, both will interpret the situation as a source of stress, but their emotional reaction to the traffic jam, that is the amount of internal distress or arousal they experience, may be dramatically different. This emotional reaction is anxiety. Worry, meanwhile, is a thought process that fuels anxiety. Worry is the anticipation of a threat. Newman says worry is when you get caught up in one thought leading to another and another that escalates your anxiety. Returning to the traffic jam example, if a commuter feels anxious even before leaving the house because he's concerned that there could be congestion or an accident on the road, that's an example of worry. Whether anxiety is triggered by stress or worry, or a mixture of both, it activates the body's emergency response system, says Darlene Kurtz, an associate professor of psychology at the University of Florida. The pulse quickens and the muscles grow tense, digestion slows, and immune cells release pro-inflammatory molecules that can help repair wounds and repel infection in the case of injury. These are just a few of the internal shifts the human body undergoes in response to anxiety, and they are designed to help you escape from danger. These shifts are driven by fluctuations in stress-related hormones, namely cortisol and epinephrine. Let me see how can I pronounce that word. Epinephrine, I don't know. Epinephrine or epinephrine, I have no idea. This is the most newest word I never heard in my life. But here we go. And depending on the duration and intensity of the anxiety a person experiences, these fluctuations can be mild or severe. In the brain, anxiety is associated with the activation or deactivation of a diverse array of structures and networks. These patterns of brain activity seem to vary depending on the type of anxiety. For example, there's evidence that phobias heavily involve emotion-generating regions of the brain, while GAD also involves changes to activity within prefrontal regions that manage planning and decision-making. Both above and below the neck, the cascade of effects that anxiety induces can in some cases lead to health problems or dysfunction. Kurtz explains that when cortisol reaches receptors in organs throughout the body, it can bend to DNA and alter gene expression. This is one way in which anxiety may affect the function of tissues or organs and thereby cause or contribute to pain, gastrointestinal dysfunction, and other acute or chronic ailments. When it comes to mental health disorders, there's a well-established link between anxiety and depression, although experts says the connection between the two is complicated. They're definitely intertwined, but their relationship can be tough to tease apart, says Dr. Valerio. For some people with an anxiety disorder, the distress caused by the symptoms and the effect on the person's life and relationships could leave them feeling depressed. Another possibility is that the mental activation associated with anxiety can leave people vulnerable to depression. Depression theory is the idea that when you get really aroused as a result of anxiety, then that can eventually deplete you and deplete. I don't know. Deplete you and lead to a depressed mood. Newman says, here, let me get a pronouncer here.
Deplete.
Deplete. Yeah.
Deplete.
Deplete. Okay. Can eventually deplete you and lead to a depressed mood. Newman says anxiety researchers have found that the more often anxiety-related brain pathways are activated, the more sensitive and likely to fire up they become. In other words, anxiety breeds more anxiety. While this may lead some with anxiety to endeavor to stamp it out, experts say that trying to suppress fear and worry is counterproductive. Embracing anxiety rather than pushing it away could actually be one of the best and most effective ways to trim its claws. Treating the disorder. Certain drug interventions can help some people with anxiety disorders. Harvard's Siegel says these come in two broad categories. The first is composed of benzodiazepines. Unknown word.
Benzodiazepine.
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 Benzodiazepines and related drugs. These are the next page here. So I'm up to page 14. So page 14 here. So stick around, folks.